Okay, so yeah, there's a few apologies tonight. So those people will be listening to the recording. So just remember, you folks, that this is the time and this is the record of the time. And for the record of the time, I'm going to say the Sophist, answering Parmenides, winter 2021, session 4, the battle of the gods and the giants. So today we'll continue a little bit more with this playing around with the concept of being and not being, and representing nothing and symbolizing nothing, things like that. But not for too long, because we need to catch up on last week's reading and this week's reading. And I'm pretty confident we'll be able to do that. And so then we will be caught up. And the reading for next week is pretty much the climactic passage of the whole dialogue. So hopefully we'll be all ready for that next week. Now I'm going to share the screen again. Okay. And let me know if you can't see it. Okay. So, again, what are we looking at? Don't worry, this page is intentionally left blank. Is it confusing? Is there some ambiguity here? Some anxiety? Here we go. Is that better? I feel better. But is the confusion gone? Is it better to have it like this? Or like this? Or like this? Think about this. I am saying nothing. This sentence that I'm saying is saying nothing. But it's not blank. And I am saying something. And so is Shakespeare. Out, out, brief candle. Life's but a walking shadow, and then is heard no more. It's a tale told by idiots, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. Signifying nothing. Signifying something. Ceci n'est pas une pipe. This is not a pipe. This is not a pipe. It's a picture of a pipe. It is a likeness, a correspondence, and it is other. It is other and not the thing. This is a pipe. This is not a pipe, but corresponds with the idea of the pipe. Not and nothing are everywhere. In every distinction we make, same, not other. And in every representational likeness, signifying the thing, but not being it. This is not a pipe. The picture of the pipe is true to the form of the pipe, which it is not. Signifying something is also signifying that it is not something else. Consider again foreground and background, like the island, not the sea. Down below the surface of the sea, the background of the fish is the water of the sea. But go up, and it becomes the birds. The birds, the background is the sky. But go down, and it is the fish. One is not its other. One is not its other. Not and nothing is everywhere, in between things, in every distinction we make. How does your computer make distinctions? How does your computer make distinctions? Down at the base, in every case, it's open or closed. We sometimes say 0 and 1. Do you hear that a lot? You see imagery of computers, zeros and ones flying around everywhere. But we know 0 and 1 are only notation. At base, the computer needs no notation. Like the counting board, it doesn't need to mark the other of 1. It is just not 1. We can think of it as on, which is not off, and off, which is not on. Same and other, not 1 and 1. Now, remember the bottles on the wall? Remember when we got to the last bottle? And if one green bottle should accidentally fall, there'll be no green bottles? No green bottles? Why do we say no green bottles when it's an empty wall? What else is not on the wall? No bottles, no birds, no pink elephants, no Humpty Dumpty, no Chinaman. The number of things that we can say are not on the wall is inexhaustible. And we can generalize and say, no thing, nothing is on the wall. And then remember the ancient counting, where they used place value, beads on a wire or pebbles in columns or boxes. And where there was an empty space, there was no, the empty space was indicated by an empty space. And so when we do 101, there's an empty space in the middle. When we mark 100, there's 2 empty spaces for the 10s and the 1s. In this case, an absence is indicated by an absence. In our notational place value system, with 101, the 0 represents nothing. The none is marked. The none is marked. This is like saying no thing, none, not being. A cipher is a place marker for not none. 0 means zero, meaning 0 is a cipher. A cipher standing for not something is like 0 for not a tens in the 101. This 0 is marking there's nothing here. And this is like the Sophist. The 0 is saying what is not. And this is like no pink elephants, no bottles. Now compare cipher with the Platonic other. Justice, not justice, where injustice is the other side of justice. Island, not sea, where C is the other side of Ireland. Same with pink elephants and same with our bottles. What is not on the wall? The negation is the other side of the affirmation. The negation is always the other side of the affirmation. Okay. Now, I just wanted to finish this section off by coming back to the question that the questions that Vula and Effie asked last week, and I kind of felt like I didn't really answer them very well. And so it might just be helpful to just think about here. And we did it a little bit in geometry, if you did geometry, exactly what counting is. Okay, so let's first make a distinction. Let's make the distinction of a sphere, this sphere. Okay, now here is another sphere. How do you know it's not the same sphere? And I've done a trick on you. Well, if we have them together, we can say, here's a sphere and another sphere. So they are the same. You're making the same distinction again. So you're saying one and another. And so you're saying one and another. And if you're counting a third one, it's one and another. That's not the one or the other, it's another other. So we're seeing here, this is Platonic logistics, so counting and calculation, right? Where we're counting things, okay? And counting is an othering. Now, counting is also, and we can see it here, ordinal. You do it in order. If you remember, well, think about counting sheep in a pen. So you've got a pen, you're out in the farm, you've got a pen, there's lots of sheep there and they're running around, they're all excited. And there's a sheepdog running around and you're trying to count them, but you can't. They keep moving. So how do you count them? You count them perhaps by making them go through a gate one by one. Okay, and you count them by correspondence. Okay, so there's all these sheep, there's sheep in the yard, and now we're letting them through a gate, and I'm counting them. 1 sheep, 2 sheep, 3 sheep, 4 sheep, and so on. I keep counting, and I get to 10 sheep, but I've run out of fingers. So how can I keep counting the sheep? Stop that there. What about I put one of these in my cup, right? And that represents 10 sheep. So then I can start counting again. So now, and then I can keep doing this and I can keep putting pebbles or my spheres in a cup. And I could start off by counting by just using my pebbles or my spheres. And this is perhaps how place value counting actually started. And therefore it's not surprising, is it, that place value counting in various civilizations is base 10, right? I could just count with one hand and go to 5 and then start again, but it's base 10. Now, think about this counting again as this true and false correspondence. Oh, my sheepdog goes through. Do I count that? No, it's not the same as a sheep. So if I counted that, it would be false. Okay, if the correspondence doesn't work, if one extra sheep jumped in and I missed it, and there were 10 sheep in there and only nine fingers, it's false. The fingers are false. So true and false by correspondence. Okay, so now finally, consider the space in which the counting occurs. Okay, now think about with the spheres or the pebbles that I put in my cup to count the sheep, right? Look at this. There's inside and there's outside. In much the same way that when we make a simple distinction on the page and draw a circle, we say we distinguish inside from outside. And the same with the sheep in the yard. We're not counting all the sheep. We're just counting the sheep in the yard. We're not counting all my ping pong balls. We're just counting the ping pong balls that are in this cup, inside and outside. So remember when Vula said last week, when we were talking about the counting board, she said, there's a void there that's screaming out. That void is a distinction already made between inside and outside. If there's nothing inside, it's an absence. It's a silence screaming out. Just like the void on the counting board with the pebble, with no pebbles yet placed in it. And just like, as Shakespeare crudely put it, the O between the lady's legs that the one would like to enter, the distinction of an absence that can be filled. That, the void itself, is a distinction. So there you have it. Being and not being, as discussed in the reading, is in the form same, not other. Same as like. But the likenesses, find the likenesses and collect them together. Then distinguish them. Make a distinction, make the decision, make the vision, make the cut in the right place. Where it makes sense to cut, distinguish it and name it. The name corresponds to the distinction, but is not it. The name is used in the account of it, in the logos, in a dialogue like the one we're having right now. The account of experience is not the experience, but it corresponds to the experience through the names. Like the account of the weather map. Remember last week? Like the account of the sheep. A correspondence. And like the account, the biological cell with all the labels on it. The names indicate distinctions as same, not other, where other is not or none. And then counting, logistic, counting things as othering, distinguishing one and finding another, and another, and another, and another that is the same in some respects. It's the same distinction again and again. So there you go. Can you see how we're now getting down into the heart of Plato, into these kind of really elementary things? We're almost getting beyond a relation to particular sensible things and talking about these weird abstract things like being and not being. So how are we coping? Are we getting there okay? Any questions or comments or reflections before we get on to the reading?
I just feel like what you've said now was very different to the original 10 green bottles on the wall. Because when you had no green bottles, you said there could be no anything, like no elephant, no Chinaman. If you had one green bottle, you'd still have no elephant and no Chinaman. So there's the question of relevance. We're focusing on green bottles and you're bringing in other, like if you're counting sheep, you don't confuse the foxes for the sheep, right? So you're counting sheep and your distinction will be only with the relevant item. Whereas last week you started off by confusing the element a little bit, which sent me, you know, I've been confused about that all week and trying to work out how that would happen. But I kind of understand what you said today, but I don't know how it fits in with looking at, you know, green bottles and then referring to no elephants or pink elephants, you know.
Yeah. Well, I'm sorry I confused you. Does someone else want to have a
It's
go?
good. It's good.
Yeah.
It's good that you can.
Does someone else want to have a go at I mean, basically Effie's explained it, I think. Does someone else want to have a go at explaining that? What's going on when we're talking about there's no green bottles and then there's no other things as well? Someone want to have a riff on that? Okay, well, yeah, I'm sorry that I confused you, but it's really about thinking about the reason you say there's no green bottles is because that there were green bottles there previously. I mean, this is what you are saying, and I'm sorry I confused you. But it is a funny thing to think about, isn't it? That, well, there's lots of other things as well. And I'm just really drawing attention to the fact that when we say none or nothing, you know, or not, or whatever, drawing attention to the fact that whenever we say it, it is actually relative. So we say to the kids sing, there's no green bottles sitting on the wall because one just fell off. But if it was a nursery rhyme about Humpty Dumpty falling off the wall, then we'd say there's no Humpty Dumpty on the wall. What are you talking about green bottles for? So it's just drawing attention to the notion that we have of an absolute void, and we can talk about an absolute void, and then realizing that really no and nothing, no and not and nothing are all always relative, and we can only refer to them in that relative way.
So then is what you're saying, I understand where Effie's coming from, but I think I'm kind of understanding where you're coming from as well. I'm starting to put the two together, I think. So would it be that effectively this is an exercise, so it's not so much about the green bottles, it's about helping us to understand the concept of being and not being? Have I understood it?
Yeah, that's right. It's like when you read this text, like and the way they approach it, in a way, it doesn't really feel like initially feel like there's much at stake here, right? And so in a way, it seems a bit silly, their problem and then their solution, but actually what their problem's doing is addressing something very profound in going across the entire history of Western philosophy and Western science. And it relates very much to the contemporary debate in philosophy. And so what I'm trying to do is to bring you to see, to become aware of, right, what's going on here, you know, with naming nothing. And what does it mean to name nothing when zero marks the empty space? And so when we come to, as we have come to in the reading, to this discussion of being and not being, and how you deal with being and not being, and how that relates to other forms, yeah, it will be a bit easier to come in and see, well, what's at stake here? What are they discussing? Yeah, that is more general than the particular discussion about the sophist saying what is false and therefore saying what is not, and then what does it mean to say what is not? Well, it's an interesting thing, isn't it? What does it mean to say not is what? We use it all the time. Zero is saying what is not.
Yeah, thank you.
Would you be aware? Sorry. Would you be aware of a void if you weren't aware of something having been there previously?
Well, yeah, this is pretty much the point, Vola, when I was saying, not previously perhaps, but also relative to its container, you could have a void that is permanently empty, right, in some sense, but it would be relative to its container. I don't know, what would be an example? You know, you think you've got your double glazed windows and the space between, well, it's got air in it, but it's got no visible object in it. It is a void in some sense. A vacuum flask has a void, you know, but it's a space between, it's relative. When you try to think of space, outer space, it's pretty easy to think about it in terms of having planets within that space and there being space between the planets.
Yes.
It's very difficult to think about it, a space like that with nothing in it. You know, you want to put your hands inside it and then feel the space, but if you can't put your hands inside it, there's nothing to relate it to. So really, this is in Platonism. I mean, Leibniz was big on this in a debate with Isaac Newton. He was a Platonist, and Isaac Newton and the school in Cambridge, where he was describing space in this way, and they were seeing space as absolute and the context in which everything occurs. The space is already spaced out. And so this actually caused great problems in the history of physics before Einstein, who reintroduced relativism. So before Newton, there was relativism in terms of space and time and so on. But after Newton, Henry Moore actually seemed to start this trend at Cambridge. And then Isaac Newton picked it on, that there's this absolute space out there in which you put things in. Now, Descartes didn't think this. Galileo didn't think this. The general trend through the West was this relativism. This was introduced, and so it had to be revolutionized with Einstein, with his relativity. Okay, so it does relate to big issues like this in science, but also it relates to issues specifically in philosophy, like the philosophy of Jacques Derrida and some of the French schools.
I understand that, and I understand what you're saying. Perhaps I'm looking at two different faces of the void. One, the void that you just explained, and one, the void that's more materialistic in the moment, I guess. Like if I say there is no apples on my table, it doesn't mean my table is void of everything. It means there are 0 apples. So I understand the void, which includes everything as you speak, but it seems to be another face of that 0 as well.
No, that's the point.
Maybe I need time.
No, that's the point, Effie. There's no apples. It's relative to apples, right? And even when there's no cups, it's relative to cups. This is exactly the point. It's the other side of cups. It's the other side of green bottles. It's the other side of Humpty Dumpty, right? And then we just get more general and we say, there's no thing on the table, right? And thing, nothing. You know, we say nothing. We don't even think about what nothing means. No thing. There's nothing on the table. So think of thing, right, as a very general form. If we're Platonists, right, think thingness is a very general form, right, isn't it? You know, especially when we say I'm not thinking about anything. So you're also maybe referring to concepts. When you say nothing, I thought nothing about that. I'm referring to even concepts. So when I say nothing, I actually mean no thing or no concept. So thing there is a very general form, and nothing is the other to that, like the island in the sea. Thing, nothing. There's nothing on my table. So there's no apples on my table. There's no, if there was just an apple, no, go and get the apple off my table. No, there's no apples. Oh, sorry, I ate it. You know, go and get the cup of tea. No, someone else drank it. Or it fell on the floor. You know, this is what I'm trying to bring you to, Effie. This
I think I get it.
That none and no, negation, is opposite, is other in Plato.
Okay, I think something like a penny just dropped. Thank you for your patience.
Okay, no worries, no worries. Yeah.
Does that correlate then with their laws, like that only certain people were allowed to vote and not females or slaves? A bit like our laws now, like that zero tolerance, 0 to alcohol if you're driving at 18, 0 to no COVID cases.
So yeah, how does it relate there? It's like an absolute. It's like going for the absolute.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe it's
only certain. So the green bottles correlate to just males voting, but not anyone else.
Because
you're not male.
Women are invisible, for example.
And slaves and whatever.
Yeah, that's right, I suppose. Well, okay, there's a good example. What about the, is this right? The US Constitution, where didn't they say everyone is equal or something, but that didn't include slaves?
Yeah.
You know, because they did that while there was slavery. Yeah. So, because slaves just weren't in the equation.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
In the same way that women weren't in the equation or slaves in the ancient Greek discussion of politics and so on. Yeah, I see what you're getting at, Helen. That's very good. Very. You might use
so
that.
you can't have 1 or 2 COVID cases. It's got to be 0 or we're ever allowed to do anything else again. So it's that 0, almost the laws of zero tolerance these days. I wonder if that's got any sort of correlation these days to the green bottles, where the green bottles.
Good. Okay. Anyone else before I get into the reading about this non-being, counting, correspondence, truth and false in correspondence?
Yeah, I just had a question, Bernie. I was just thinking about when we think about empty space between objects. So empty space between planets, say, that is obviously still a thing. It's not a no thing. There's still something there, right? It's not a void. It's empty space, which is a thing. It's not a void. Is that correct?
Okay. So Paul, what we're doing here is we're going to the form of the distinctions that you're making, right? So you are calling it there. You're naming it as empty space, right? In the same way that I might say, when I empty this room, you know, when I'm about to move out, I say the room is empty, right? I know it's not empty, it's got air in it or whatever. When you say that there's empty space between those planets, we all know what you mean. There might be gases or there might be radiation or there might be whatever else there, but we know what you mean by it when you make that distinction. Just like when I say, the room is empty, you can move in. It's empty, the room is empty space. So it's really what we're talking about here is on the level of making the distinction and constructing your reality, and not sort of some absolute notion, like we've got some absolute notion of defining the reality as some external absolute material world. We're just really just talking here about the way we construct our experience and we interact with our experience and make sense of our experience. Okay, anyone else? All right, well, look, I'm going to dive into the reading now, and I think I might go, I don't know, I'll see how I go. I might run out of breath. So sit back and pick up your pen if you like, and I'll take you through last week's reading and this week's reading, just trying to bring it all together in front of you right now so that we can discuss it and get ready for what happens next week. Okay, I just might give myself a drink. So remember, we started with the definition of the angler, right? And this was a practice in the method of formal division. The method of division moves from general to particular, collecting likenesses and making divisions of difference. So you have areas of likeness, and then you make a distinction for the difference in our common experience of the world, right? So we're working together in our common experience of our world. Your experience is similar to mine. The aim is to make the cut in the right place, where it makes sense. We started with the division of arts, remember, techne, and then divided and divided again, going down just one side to do our definition, because that's what you do when you make a definition of something, just like in biological classification. We start with the arts and never moved outside the arts. All subsequent divisions are within this higher division of the arts. Have you noticed that? Angling is an art, and so is sophistry. But what kind of art is sophistry? Various ways of defining the sophist are proposed, and along the way, there are some interesting excursions. One of these, remember, was the excursion into the arts that also involved collecting likenesses together and making divisions. So he talked of straining, filtering, purifying. Think of all those processes that we do in processing, like foods and chemicals and that sort of thing, where we have to separate things and bring like things together. Well, he had examples of this in his time. These are all arts of division or discrimination analogous to his dialectic. However, this dialectic is not doing so well with defining the sophist. With many definitions, 6 in all, this suggests that we still haven't found the key thing, the main feature of the sophist art. So we try again. This common feature must surely be something to do with the sophist being a disputer, an anti-logic, a teacher of disputation. So let's examine this. What does the sophist dispute about? Divine things, yeah. Things of the senses, yeah. Social and political matters, yes. In fact, they are experts in every type of knowledge. But hang on, they can't be experts in everything. That's impossible. No one can. So they conclude they must be fakers. They must pretend to know what they don't know. They must say things that they don't know and then fool their younger students into thinking that they do know. Now, this leads to a bit of an excursion about pretending to know all compared to pretending to make all. Pretending to know all things is like pretending to make all things, which is what is done in the arts of imitation. Representational painting is an art of imitation, and it can be used to fool small children into thinking that it is real. So too in sophistry. The art of pretending to know what is real can fool naive young students who don't have much idea about what is true. The sophist is a sort of magician, an illusionist, which is a productive art over in that other circle. He is a producer of imitations that fool the young. But what sort of imitation is he producing? Well, there's two types of likenesses. One which is like a model with all the right proportions, and the other mimics the appearance. If you're interested in these two types, I can break it down and discuss it in the discussion. I've got a little graphic for it too. The stranger can't decide to which the sophist belongs. But he's got a problem, because we are saying that the sophist is saying that falsehood really exists. This seems to involve the contradiction prohibited by Parmenides, not to think or say that not being is. Parmenides said, never let this thought prevail, that not being is. But keep your mind from this way of investigation. But that way of investigation is exactly where we're heading, into the territory forbidden by Parmenides. And so we move into the reading for week 3. To what is the designation of not being to be applied? So the name, not being, what is it applied to? This is where it's helpful to remember our discussion of saying negations of zero and how it signifies nothing. At least we know that not being cannot be applied to any being. How can you call any being not being? It's a contradiction. What can we say has not being? Something? Anything? No. Everything has being. So we've ruled everything out. Now, this is a very broad notion of being we're working with here. Concepts have being too. Justice, the good, the idea of the sophist, a god, a dream, they all have being. Quantities like large and small, slow and fast, hot and cold, they all have being of some sorts. Indeed, anything that you can name or refer to has being. When you use a name, it must be naming something or it doesn't make sense. When you use a name, it must be naming something or it doesn't make sense. It's like a word from a foreign language that you don't know. So if you were to name non-being, you would be naming a thing. One thing that is not one thing. If I start naming not ones, then I get all these nones. And so nones become multiple. Multiple nones? Can there be multiples of these non-beings? That would be like saying there's all these no green bottles, there's no birds, and there's no big pink elephants. They're all sitting on the wall. This is absurd. If I say something significant, I mean not meaningless, then it must refer to something, to some concept. That's how language works. So you cannot speak of not being. At page 238C, not being is inconceivable, inexpressible, unspeakable, alogos, irrational. Defining not being might be the greatest difficulty of philosophy. If there were not one worse, refuting non-being. Consider when I say not being is not plural, or not being is not singular, or even not being is not. I'm naming not being, and I'm saying it is something. That is, whenever I apply a predicate, even when I say it is not singular or not plural, or it is not. In refuting it, I'm invoking it and thereby directly contradicting myself. In fact, not being is unnameable. Look, I just named it. Not being is unnameable. This is why you must be silent. But see that rascal sophist, what he's gone and done. He's hiding in a region that cannot be explored. We want to say that he says what is not, but we can't say it. And his hiding place is defended by his linguistic reductionism. At 239E, the sophist is given as enforcing a linguistic reduction. Everything must be defined in language logically. You can't just point to things. What is an image? It's like a mirror. What is a mirror? Define it. The sophist will insist on remaining with only what can be deduced from words. Now, there's an important aside here. It pays to remember, firstly, how Plato's view differs. We will come to it again. Discourse logos only gives an account of the formal nature of reality. It only gives an account. Remember, we're talking about the account, like the account of the weather map, the logos. Indeed, the supposed position of the sophist is close to modern philosophy. In the so-called linguistic turn in modern philosophy, language rules. Everything must be said, or at least all that is known must be in the form of its communication, the form of the sign. They see us, Platonists, as mystics, and they reject mysticism. Anyway, in this linguistic reduction, the sophist defends his position. The rascal sophist is hiding in this region that can't be explored for these reasons. We want to say that the sophist says what is false, but that has just been shown to be impossible because he can't possibly say not being is. He must be saying some kind of being is. Now that the problem is defined in this way, some progress can be made. But Theaetetus says, surely an image does have some kind of existence. I mean, it is getting a bit ridiculous, isn't it, here? Like a painting of a thing is not the thing. Okay, it's an imitation of the thing. It's not the thing, but it still has some kind of existence in itself. And while it is not the being of the thing, it is a likeness of the thing. So an imitation is both a likeness of what is real and in itself has a reality. The consideration of likeness suggests that being and not being are somehow entangled with each other. Theaetetus is rather perplexed by where the stranger has taken things. Not being, he says, on page 240C, not being does seem to have got entangled with being. And this is very absurd. What has become clear is that if the sophist is to be defined as the faker, that then we must be saying not being is and being is not. We have to say this, but how can we say this? We must find a way to do this if we are going to catch the sophist, because remember, this is the defining feature of the sophist, he promotes that which is like the true, which is only partly true. So his false opinion is, to some extent, about what is not. And the sophist leads us to believe that what is not is. The stranger does not balk at this challenge, but only asks pardon on 3 accounts. Firstly, to step back from the argument, he wants to make a digression to solve this problem. And secondly, to defy the prohibition of his father, to refute him as though he were to commit patricide. And finally, to refute his very own argument as he's made it so far, to say that in a sense, not being is. Now, at this point, we get a survey of ontologies that were around at the time, which are interesting for various reasons. Theaetetus agrees to the strategy, and so they move on. And so they have this kind of lit review, as we might call in science, looking at what everyone else says. Some schools say there are 3 realities. Some say there are 2, wet, dry, hot and cold. Some say that there are many and 1. Some that there is alternation between a state of love and of strife, of war. But notice, each position implies an underlying being. If there are 2 realities, then they both are. There must be some underlying being under the multiplicity of beings. This is to show that the question of being, not being, underlies all these positions. For example, if I say that all is hot and cold, then hot is and cold is. Therefore, both exist. Their existence, their being, seems to be a commonality that underlies them both. In this sense, the 2 must be one being, one being. And in this way, we are brought back to Parmenides, who says, only being is, all is one. So let's pause here and review Parmenides' position, at least from the Platonic point of view. If all that is, it is being, then all being is one and the same being. So we come to and start with the oneness of being. If there is anything else other than being, then it must be different from being. It must be, wholly or partly, not being. But to say something is not being is to say, to name that which does not exist. So only one is, one being. There is no difference or differentiation or change or variation. All that is, and it is one and the same. Now, of course, there are all sorts of difficulties with this view, and some of them are presented here. Like, if there is really only one, then its name, one, can't be separate from it. But then it would be a name without anything named, which has the same absurdity as naming not being. But then it seems to have two names, one and being. To start with, how can there be only one if it has two names? This gets more absurd. Think of the sentence, one is. It seems to mean one exists. Look at this. Remember, we're doing logic here. We're doing logic. Look at this sentence. There is one and the fact that it exists. There is the subject of the sentence, one, and the predicate exists.
Bernie, sorry, I'm not sure if it was just me, but I think you just cut out at a really key section there.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
How am I going now?
Just go back about 2 sentences.
Okay, so had I finished the summary of Parmenides? Yeah. Okay,
Yes.
So I said, yeah. So of course, there's problems with this view, right?
Yes. Yes.
And so the name has to be the same as the thing, and then that would be absurd because there's only a name and nothing named, which is just like naming not being. But then it seems to be two names, one and being. And so this is where we get into this logical analysis, which we also get in Plato's Parmenides, dealing with only one is. So one is means one exists. Look at this sentence, and we're talking about a sentence here. This is linguistics, logic, I should say. There is one and the fact that it exists. One exists. The subject of the sentence, one, and the predicate, which tells you its existence. Now consider the subject, one, separate from its predicate, exists. Does this subject, the one, exist in itself? Surely it does. Let's start that again. If one is means one exists, and so there is one separate from its existence, it also exists, then the original existence that is supposed to be one is deprived of the separate being of one. The original existence that is supposed to be one is deprived of the separate being of one as the subject of the sentence. If so deprived, then this original being will have not being, the not being of the separate one, because it's separate. And so being will not be all that exists, because it's distinct from the one that is separate from it, the subject of the sentence. Now, you don't really have to follow that, but it is important in challenging the linguistic approach because it brings you right into what's called the logical paradox. And it's also developed in Plato in the Parmenides, which you remember is a parallel text here, where you get this infinite regression, where you keep separating off the one, because you get a new one exists, and then the subject is separate from exists, and then that has a being, and so on. It just goes on and on and on. So don't worry too much about it, but what is Plato doing here? Well, it's similar to what he does in the Parmenides. Parmenides and Zeno have critiqued the claim that not being is, right? Basically, they've had to go at everyone who proposes any theory, and they've said, well, you know, you're saying that not being is. You must just say that all is being, all is one. But now in the Sophist, we have a follower of Parmenides and Zeno, remember, introduced as a follower of Parmenides and Zeno, showing how Parmenides being, his only one is, his all is one, is just as problematic. And hence it leaves us in a position of utter skepticism, which is also what Plato has Parmenides, right, the fictional Parmenides, doing in his dialogue called Parmenides. Plato shows that we are equally in the dark about being and not being. So week 3 reading ends. It is no easier to define the nature of being than of not being. We're in complete skepticism. Okay, so that's the end of the reading for week 3. And it will be shorter, my summary of the reading for week 4, but I think I'll have a break and we can deal with any questions, comments or reflections on that reading.
I think even if we get some opinions, that would be great. It doesn't even have to be a reflection. I'd love to hear some opinions because I'm a little confused with it all. So I just want to hear some opinions. No takers?
I'll have a go, Jackie. Now, this is going back a few steps, I'm sure, but I just want to check something. By naming something, are we giving it the gift of existence by merely naming it?
That's a really good question. Yeah. Maybe in a way we are, because in naming it, maybe sometimes we make the distinction at the same time. But if I use a name, right? So if I go, if I just make a noise, like if I go, rah, rah, right? Is that a name? No, that's a noise, right? It doesn't mean anything to me. It doesn't mean anything to you.
Still named it noise.
Yeah, right. Okay. So I named the sound noise, but the name isn't doing this correspondence thing, right? So language has an existence in itself, right? I mean, this is an important point too, right? So when we talk about, obviously, we talk about the logos, we have the discussion of the form. So we've got the form of reality, of the distinctions we make, right? And we have the discussion. The discussion itself, of course, also has a form, just like the painting has a form, as well as the landscape that's being painted. It has a form and a reality. So here we're talking about, does something come into existence when we name it? The answer probably, Vula, is no, doesn't, because you have to formally make the distinction yourself privately or as a group, right? So we say, you know, like we're fixing machinery, you know, we call it the widget or the whatchamacallit or whatever, you know, we're fixing that. Oh, that whatchamacallit's gone again. You know, you might give it a silly name on the left or whatever. You might give it a silly name or whatever, but it doesn't make sense that you name when there's nothing that's been distinguished previously.
It can become a bit circular because not naming is naming it not naming as well. So the absence of name is naming it absence name.
Okay, run that by me one more time.
Connect via
I wish I could. So it's just there's a bit of concern that it can become a little bit circular in that not naming could be that is naming it too, naming it not naming. I mean, you can give it any name, but you know, just not naming becomes in itself an existence.
Okay. well, one thing you can say is that you can make distinctions and not name them. I think we do that all the time in our private world, when you're working with when I'm working with a piece of machinery, I make distinctions between things, but I don't name them. There's plants in my garden or weeds in my garden that I don't know the name of, but I make the distinction. So there's that. But I think you're pointing towards something else, Effie.
So guys, we had technical issues. I was thinking by naming something, let's say justice and apologies, if this has been mentioned and we missed it, we make justice exist, right? So that's how I see it. That naming that does give existence.
Well, you can make no, not really. Okay, so let's go through this. This is quite good. This is quite a good discussion to have. So you can make a distinction privately, right? You can make distinctions privately in your world, and we often do when we're alone. And then when we communicate with each other, we match them up. So Aunt Agatha might make distinctions between her chickens, and she has no other visitors, right? And she makes distinctions with them, and she may not name them, right? But she knows which is which. But then when she wants to communicate with me when I go and visit, she needs to say, make that distinction and give it this name, And you think if you're going through and looking through her garden and she's got all these different plants, she's saying, make that distinction of that plant and give it this correct name. And so this is what we do generally in life, and of course in science as well, but don't worry too much about science, because we really do formalize it in science, of course, don't we? Because we need to. So naming doesn't make the distinction. You need to make the distinction and then give it a name, I think. And then it has a public name when you say this to someone else, you say, make that distinction that I'm making and give it this name. Does that help?
Okay.
I don't think really. Maybe we can talk about it again. Why?
I think further down when the text talks about reality, that's where it made sense to me, and what is real and coming together. Otherwise, a lot of things are, like you said, linguistic and ending up in absurd, being absurd. But when it comes to, yes, what is real and what we include in real, as the text was going on, yeah, that's when I understood.
Okay, well, maybe that's, if no one's got an immediate question, maybe that's a good cue for me to go into this battle of the gods and the giants. There's not a lot of content here, so it shouldn't take me too long. So he's done this review of these ontologies, right? These various ontologies, right? Theories of being, and these there's two or there's three. It's strife and peace. It's hot and cold and wet and dry and those sorts of things. And then he focuses in on two particular groups that are like polar opposites. And we call them, generally call them the materialists, who say that, the only things that are real are like what I can grasp in my hand. right? So there's an extreme position which says nothing else is real, just what I can grasp. So what I can feel and touch, that basically has some sensible bodily presence. Okay, and then there's the other extreme, are those that say all that is real is insensible, you know, beyond the senses, unchanging, right? So forms, right? So who are these schools? It's hard to say because much is lost. As far as the materialists go, we could we certainly have some suggestion of who they might be. So Democritus, with his atomic theory, atoms of matter, that reality is made up of uncut pieces of matter that build up in various ways. And then we've got, it seems to be, by other evidence, like proto-Epicureans, who were this Hellenistic school of what we might call empiricists, certainly, and probably materialists. So that, you know, it's all about what's coming from the senses. Now, the idealists are harder to find, at least outside Plato, his academy, his academic fellows, and Pythagoreans. And there is a view that Plato is giving an account of his own earlier view, which is he is either rejecting or advancing. So these fictional characters in this dialogue might be talking about Plato's view, right? His earlier view that we might find in the Phaedrus or earlier theories of forms in the Euphythro and so on. This is especially in the argument against forms being unchanging. Remember when we did the Phaedo and the forms were unchanging outside time and had the characteristics of the divine. They were divine. Also so he's moving on from that, perhaps, and also to the idea of elementary forms and the way they participate in each other. So there you have it. Take it how you like. There's various sort of positions to take on this, but certainly there is an opening up or a changing in this dialogue, as we've already seen, right, with the treatment of the formal nature of our experience. Anyway, with the materialists, the main thing is he's trying to do is to get them to say, I mean, it's all just in their heads, but he's trying to get them to admit that the soul exists and that there are concepts that the soul knows, such as justice, that they exist and that they are insensible beyond the senses. But they seem to say that the soul has some form of shadowy body. And alas, it's hard to pin them down, these materialists. And they will say that the soul has body and such, so on. And so what they need to do in this dialectic, to be true dialecticians after the truth, is to strengthen their argument. This is where the stranger introduces the hypothesis that being is nothing but power, dynamis, right? Power, potential, an active or a passive receptive force. So like yin and yang, right? It's either active or passive receptive, right? With this settled, they suddenly turn to the idealists, but the idea of being is power will be taken up there. I find the transition a bit weird. I feel like he's talking about the materialists and then suddenly we're on to the idealists and then this idea emerges. So I think he's trying to bring in, maybe in a clunky way, but usually it's me that's wrong and I realize that it's written in a really clever way. I just don't realize it. But in a clunky way, it seems that he's trying to bring in this thing about change, right? Change, motion. It's not someone's translation is motion. I think the better translation is change. right? In general, it's a more general term. With the idealists, there is the Platonic division between being of the forms and becoming of sensible things. We've come across this before in Plato. We have an intercourse with them both. Now, the language is the same language as sexual intercourse. Remember in Theaetetus? Kind of like invoking that discussion again here. Very similar discussion. Sometimes it's translated as participation, but in this case, it is the word intercourse is a good translation. Intercourse with becoming is through the bodily senses. Intercourse with being is through the soul. According to these idealists, only does the intercourse with becoming involve the power of action and of being acted upon, that yin and yang stuff. This view is challenged by the stranger. But surely knowing is an action. And so there must be change in knowing of being, knowing of the forms. And surely life and soul and understanding are in the realm of the ideal real. And they surely change. So there must be change in the being of the real. Is this Plato introducing this notion, transforming his forms theory? But the stranger does not want to go all the way and say all is change. Indeed, we come back to, same in Theaetetus, we come back to that polarization between all is unchanging, Parmenides, and all is change, Heraclitus, or the followers of Heraclitus. So it's those people who did the Theaetetus, remember that? Instead, the stranger finds the middle ground and says that being must be both changing and unchanging. And indeed, this is his new definition of being. Or is it? Remember before when there were those positions where, those ontologies where people had two fundamental realities or three fundamental realities, and then being was found to be underlying them both. Likewise here, if being is both the unchanging and changing, then it can't be either. Being can't be unchanging and it can't be changing. There must be an underlying being there that they participate in. Being is neither changing nor unchanging, but something beyond it. But what is it? Now, there is a complete perplexity about being as well as not being. In the face of this great perplexity, the stranger is strangely optimistic. Towards the end of the reading, he says, well, at least, since being and not being participate equally in this perplexity, then there is now some hope that as one of them emerges more clearly, so will the other. That's at 250E. And that's the end of the reading. We're left with this great perplexity about the nature of being and not being. But we focus the argument in very closely, as we shall see in the next reading. All right, so that is that we've caught up. So we're now caught up with the this week's reading. So any questions or comments or reflections on that?
Actually, Bernie, can I just add one point to what you were saying earlier about the Plato says he's talking about the giant, and he says they define reality, this is the Cornford translation, they define reality as the same thing as body. And as soon as one of the opposite party asserts that anything without a body is real, they are utterly contemptuous and will not listen to another word. And the Theaetetus says, the people you describe are certainly a formidable crew. I have met quite a number of them before now. So these are real people that Plato knows. I mean, he goes to dinner with them or whatever, or meets them on the street. So he's trying to tackle their point of view and the believers of the forms. And I think he's trying to be a bit of a peacemaker. He's trying to kind of say, well, how can we bring these together and get an agree on something, so then we can kind of, tackle the one reality we all live in anyway, which we all have to try and converge towards, So I think that Plato's actually talking about his own society, which in a sense is similar to our society today.
Yes. Yeah, thanks, Andrew. That's great.
Yeah, I feel exactly the same way, Andrew, that, he's trying to bring things together for the better understanding. Yeah. I mean, even his, what he assigns as giants and what he assigns as gods, the materialists and the idealists, there is a mixture there. Some of the materialists, these are the materialists that he can converse with, and these are the idealists that are friends of the forms. So there is there are liquid definitions,
Well, I don't know if I remember this correctly, but was there something in the reading that if the soul resides within the body, that in itself is an example of the materialists, the materialistic and the idealistic coexisting? I'm not sure where I got that.
Yeah, no. You are right. When during the conversation between the stranger and Theaetetus, and he says about the materialist that he can converse with, and they accept the existence of the soul. And you think, well, that's it. How can you accept that? I mean, I was thinking anyway, when clearly you cannot touch the soul, you cannot grasp it, like physically grasp it, and yet you accept that, yes, this is what provides life and this and that. So that's why I was thinking the middle way, and although he's talking about extreme views from the idealists and the materialists, I get the sense that these are not the extreme views. There are people who have tried to define those things and come to grasp those meanings and try to understand.
Buller, is that what you were kind of getting at, or?
Yes. I was also wondering whether it provides the perfect example of how two seeming opposites actually not only coexist but form a whole, because they exist in the same, well, how can I put it, the same structure, the same
Together. No, this is interesting. I haven't really thought about it this way, and it does relate to modern times, doesn't it? With I suppose the two divisions that we got after the Middle Ages, when they introduced Aristotle, and science came from that, and science is materialistic. That's what it is, unless it's Platonist, but it's basically materialistic. So that's that polar side, and then the other side is religion. And then this idea that there are people who just want to reject the world and get into the world of forms, like the quote on my postcard, when the soul is alone with the forms, just by itself and not connected with the body or anything, it's in this, like suggestion that it's in this bliss. And so there are these people that want to reject the world and these people who are very much into the world. And he's trying to bring the two sides together. Yeah. Thanks for that, guys. That's good. Okay, anyone else got any questions or comments? Alan, are you? I just thought you were leaning forward. I wasn't putting you on the spot. No, okay, all right. So, well, let me just say, so next week, I'm getting a bit of static from someone there. I'm not sure who it is. Oh, that's better. So next week, we're honing right in on this problem of being and not being. And I'm hope that I've prepared us a little bit for this. So we just think, well, what the hell is this? You know, it's so abstract. What's it all mean? But maybe we can get something out of that. And this is where we come to consideration of elementary forms. In doing so, we notice that these forms participate in each other. So we've seen this through our definitions, how we've got forms within forms within forms. We don't really get this in the early dialogues, and we really get it now. So next week we arrive at the climactic section of this dialogue, where the philosopher is defined as a kind of an aside, as the practitioner of dialectic, and where the problem of being and not being, sorry, the problem of the being of not being and the not being of being is solved through participation in the same other form, which is the form of all distinct ideas and things. Non-being is found everywhere. As he says, it's distributed through all existing things in their relations with each other. So that's next week. It's basically this kind of triumph. They've solved the problem. And then the following week, there's some interesting stuff that in the denouement, if you like, that comes up, like about creation from nothing and things like that. So there's still lots of good stuff ahead of us. Congratulations for getting through some very difficult reading this week, especially. Next week might be difficult, but might be a little bit more rewarding, not just so skeptical. It's actually building up to a solution. So I might turn the recording off there.